All right. Well, hello everybody, and thanks for joining us here today. My name is Brendan Roney. I'm with the Detroit Historical Society. I've worked there almost 20 years now. I'm the manager of digital projects there, which means I work with a lot of our visual and audiovisual collection. We're going to be seeing a lot of great assets from that in our presentation today, because this is our island jewel, Detroit's Belle Isle Park. I'm sure anybody who grew up in the area, who's lived here a good long time, has lots of great memories of going to Belle Isle, spending time there. It's one of my favorite places. As I was telling something beforehand, I've worked there a good long time. I've canoed the canals, played Scrabble on the beach, all kinds of fun things that I've done there. And Detroiters, going back to pretty much the beginning of Belle Isle as a park, have been building great memories on the island, and they've been really excited to share those with other people. And one of the ways, luckily for us, that they shared those was these great old picture postcards like we have right here. This particular one is from right around the turn of the century, when the park was pretty much brand new. And there's a couple great stories going on here. First of all, we see one of the park's bridges right here. This particular one isn't still standing, but if you're familiar with the park these days, if you know where the Belle Isle Casino is, just behind it there's a green metal bridge, fairly new one. It's roughly where this is. This is, of course, over one of the canals on the island here. And if those women on top of the bridge were to look behind themselves there, they'd see another neighboring bridge with something pretty cool, a cool feature to it that we'll see at the end of the presentation here. Kind of as a slight teaser to that, you might notice there's seating, some bleachers along the canal just beyond that. So what might they need those for? We'll find out. And speaking of those women, you know, this is the 1890s or very early 1900s here. It's great to see some women out enjoying themselves unaccompanied by chaperones there. So we've got a group right there enjoying that, and also we've got women canoeing around here. Back in those days, beliefs being what they were, there weren't too many athletic pursuits that were necessarily open to women in those kind of big skirts and all that. Things like cycling, which we'll talk about, and canoeing offered great options here. And we've got some ladies out enjoying the canal right there. And finally, my favorite feature in this is, if you look right in the center there, if you're just leisurely paddling around the canals here, isn't quite the approach you're using with your paddle there. Coming at it a little high there, so I think they're getting ready to splash somebody. So a little bit of fun there. So let's get into the island's history, and let's start with something that's I guess both very recent history and has to do with something that's happened in just about 3 weeks. Belle Isle was a home for world-class racing up until fairly recently. Beginning in 1992, Roger Penske brought the Detroit Grand Prix onto the western side of the island. Prior to that, it was held downtown on a course that was, it had been going on there for a good many years, but there was a lot of complaints about viewing angles and all that. You're pretty much on a street corner, and you can see the curve that's right there. Can't get a better view of the course, but also that's just kind of road racing there. So in 1992, they sought a way to kind of alleviate some of those issues, and the solution they seized upon was bringing the race to Belle Isle. Every year around St. Patrick's Day, they'd start kind of transforming the island, building up the barricades, building up the finish line, putting in stands. There were even some areas, I believe in 1998, they expanded the course a little bit, so there's actually areas that they had to keep under turf that they would expose to make some of the roads wider for passing and all that. And it was there for a good long time, up until just the past couple years. And this next month is actually going to be, it's the first year where it's not on Belle Isle, where it's going back downtown. So it's going to be interesting to see how they sort of navigate the complaints in the past. But you don't need a car to race around Belle Isle. In fact, you shouldn't, because they're very strict about those speed limits when the race isn't on. You can also race around the island in a boat. Powerboat racing has a long history around Belle Isle as well. There's been a series of hydroplane races held on the Detroit River for over 100 years. It's been on hold the last couple years, not just because of COVID, but because of kind of changes in the racing industry and the amount of boats and stuff that compete. But hopefully this year, it seems like there's always somebody who's pushing to bring it back. So fingers crossed this late summer, we might see these boats return here. The most recent incarnation is Detroit Hydro Fest, but prior to that, there was Thunderfest, and then there was all the individual trophies that they raced for here, like the Harmsworth Cup and the Gold Cup race. The Gold Cup race is actually one of the oldest events in motorsports. And it used to be kind of nomadic. So the race would occur wherever the home turf of whoever won the prize last year was at. So back in 1915, or in the lead up to the 1915 race, a group of Detroit business owners got together and they said, well, we're going to try and get the Gold Cup, bring it to Detroit, bring the race to Detroit, bring all that kind of glory and commerce to Detroit. So they sponsored a boat called the Miss Detroit, and it won that year, brought the race to Detroit. And that really started kind of a long tradition of the Cup being here. In 1917, this guy right here, Gar Wood, came on the scene. It's him right there, with the steering wheel in hand. Orland Johnson, that's his ride-along mechanic next to him there. And Gar Wood was one of the kind of first superstars of motorsports. He was from Detroit, and he raced a series of boats called the Miss America for the trophy and kept it here for a good long time. He was a kind of very dashing and very kind of like a strong personality, we'll say. He was also, he had a house right on the river. He was also a bit of an inventor. The compactors that would compact trash in garbage cans were something he worked on, or not garbage cans, in garbage trucks. So you'd see old garbage trucks with Gar Wood emblazoned in the back, which is kind of a weird way to celebrate somebody, but hey, why not? Put his name on the back of a garbage truck. But interesting guy. And this right here, this is the Miss America 10, 4 big Packard engines in there, and they're sitting right on top of them there. So you can only imagine what the exhaust is like when they get going there. It's like going right in their face there. But you don't need 4 big Packard engines or an aircraft engine like some of the later hydroplanes have to race around the water of Belle Isle. You can also do it with just your arms. The people-powered boats, can't forget those. The Detroit Boat Club isn't just the name of a building, the first building you see when you're approaching Belle Isle and your immediate left there from the bridge. There's an actual club, and the club's still in operation and has been since 1839, which makes it the oldest continuously operating rowing club in the United States. I think it's got New York beat by just a smidge there. Sailboat racing is also a constant here too. There's often races happening on Lake St. Clair and from the Detroit River. There's all kinds of other racing going on too. There's racing on foot, on skates, bicycles, model boats. And if we really want to stretch the metaphor here, there's also racing after baseballs and cricket balls and frisbees. Sheila Young, the Olympic speed skater who took home the gold medal in the 1976 Olympics, used to practice on the canals of Belle Isle. Appropriately enough, in the summer she would transition to being a cyclist, and bicycling has a long history of on Belle Isle as well. Back to the 1880s and 1890s, and of course still goes on there. There's constantly cyclists going around there. A big bicycle race was the Decoration Day race every year, which was kind of proto-Memorial Day, and we've got a view of the starting line of one of those Decoration Day races right there. That was a long tradition in the city, and there's even a bit of a rivalry between us and Chicago, who had a similar race. The Detroit Free Press Marathon, at least until this past year, included a lap around the island as well as stretches across the Ambassador Bridge and through the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, which makes it the only international underwater marathon in the world. For whatever reason, just this past year, they didn't run the lap around Belle Isle. They changed the course a little bit, and I'm not sure if that was a one-off thing or something they're going to keep doing, but I guess we'll find out. The model yacht basin, which we see right over here, one of my favorite features on the island, and one that's very easy to overlook. It's still there. It's on the Canadian side of the island. When you're gone a little bit past the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, you might see this kind of big square pool with cement sides, still filled in. It's very rare you see anybody using it for its intended purpose, which was for sailing model yachts. It used to be a thing in Detroit public schools, industrial arts or shop classes. Students would take a set of plans, they'd build a model yacht where you could set the rigging and it would catch a wind and go across there, and they'd race them across the basin here. These days it's only a couple hobbyists that will bring their boats, or they're either the traditional wind-powered sailing models or RC models, and will do some laps around the basin there. My dad has a sailboat that he built that he brings out there every now and then. So if you ever see somebody out there, maybe it's him, so say hi. We have a couple of those boats in our collection as well. Just recently we had a great exhibit over at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, which the Detroit Historical Society runs, and it was almost all the model ships in our collection, and there was a nice selection of some of those model yachts that students built as well. And when the sun goes down, we can't also forget the submarine races. I joke, these days I think they kick you off the island around 10 o'clock. Really, this is all just an excuse to talk about that we really did have submarines in Detroit. There's the USS Tambor. The Ciro and the Amherst were stationed at Broadhead Naval Armory right across from the Belle Isle Bridge there. It's kind of like McHale's Navy right here in Detroit. Never did see those guys racing though. And as another plug for the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, if you've ever visited, there's a periscope that's set up. And it's still set up so it's the lens is above the roof. You can spin it around, make sure there's no U-boats coming down the Detroit River. That's from one of these. That's from the USS Tambor, which was actually in the Battle of Midway. So it's still available to be used over at the Dawson. So the bottom line, to kind of round out this intro, is that the Belle Isle is kind of Detroit's place for fun. There's families and family reunions going on constantly there. And as you can see, the family photo on the island is a constant here. So we got everything from the days of the boater hats and the hoop skirts till we've got the 70s shot right here with the plaid pants, and we've even got some newer ones in here that I should probably sub in to have even more variety here. So let's get into the island's early history with a brief question here. What's in a name? The native Chippewa, or Ojibwe, and Ottawa, or Odawa populations that first inhabited this area knew the island as Swan Island, or Wanabazi, presumably because of the swans that nested on the island and still do. So that's our first name for the island here. The next two names are known to many Detroiters, but they're commonly given origins kind of veer into the realm of legend and tall tales that were commonly invoked in 19th century romantic popular histories. An early name attributed to the island was Snake Island, because it was said that it was the home of many snakes, and indeed I've found many a garter snake trying to get into the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. The popular story sometimes attributed to the origin of all these snakes on the island is the destruction of what is commonly termed a stone idol on the mainland by French missionaries. As the story goes, after the idol was smashed, indigenous worshippers carried the remnants of the idol to Belle Isle, where they became snakes. While the missionary René de Brehart de Galigny does indeed proudly recount of destroying a sacred site and a statue on the banks of the Detroit River with an axe, he notes that they capped off this act of desecration by dumping the fragments into the river instead of having them carried over to Belle Isle. Next, among the early French, the island was known as l'Île des Coquins. You'll even see this on early maps sometimes. And that's French for Hog Island. The often repeated story here is that French settlers brought pigs to the island so the pigs could either eat or stomp out all the snakes, depending on who's telling the story. In truth, the island was just a convenient place for livestock to graze, because the river kind of provides a natural fence to keep them from wandering too far and to keep predators from getting to them. And the island was used for this purpose for a good many years. The name Belle Isle was said to date from July 4th, 1845, from a picnic that was held that day on the island. And it was said to be inspired not by the obvious thing. I always assumed, it's another French name. It's French for beautiful, seems fitting. But the story goes that it was cooked up as a way of sucking up to Lewis Cass, whose daughter was Isabella. So name the island after her. So let's talk a bit more about some of that early history. We mentioned the indigenous and the French settlers. The next group to appear in the island's history are the British. The British Crown sought to purchase the island from the Ojibwe and the Odawa, which they did on June 5th, 1768. The actual purchase was handled by a guy by the name of Lieutenant George McDougall. And he wasn't doing it kind of for himself. He was an agent of the Crown there. And for it, he paid 8 barrels of rum, 3 rolls of tobacco, 3 pounds of vermilion, 3 pints of paint, and a wampum belt that we see right here. And this is over at the Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Public Library these days. Along with this is the deed here. And you can see the pictographs that were used to sign it there as well. The island moved into private individual hands in 1793 when it was purchased by a guy by the name of William Macomb, as he would have pronounced it. And that was 1793, and he paid about $100,000 in today's money. Macomb, or Macomb as we would pronounce it these days, was a big property owner on both sides of the river, and I'd be remiss to fail to note that this was the era when property included people. Macomb families were one of the biggest slave owners in the area. 26 people were owned by them. The Macomb family, you might be more familiar with his nephew, which is General Alexander Macomb, and he's the one they have the statue of, and he's the one that the county is named after. The statue downtown on Washington Boulevard, where he's got the kind of Napoleonic outfit and the cape and all that, because he was in the War of 1812. So 1817, another family comes into the picture. Macomb's heirs sell the island to Barnabas Campo. And if that name sounds familiar, he's the younger brother of Joseph, who is the namesake of Joseph Campo, which is the main thoroughfare of Hamtramck. And the Campos paid about $92,000 in today's money. So a bit of a break there compared to what the Macombs paid for it. It moves into public hands in 1879 when the city of Detroit purchased the island for a whopping $5 million in today's money. And they budgeted about 3 times that for buildings, bridges, and other improvements. Now, in these early years, the island had some kind of strange uses, unexpected uses. For one, it was a popular spot for dueling. People would come, it was on the Detroit River, it was kind of outside the watchful eyes of authority here. So people would come from spots like Malden or Amherstburg or Detroit, and they'd kind of settle their business on the island here. One well-known incident that happened here was in 1820. There was a guy by the name of Arthur Rankin who had kind of a reputation as a bit of a drunken lout. He got into a quarrel with a guy by the name of Henry Richardson, who had a bit of a reputation as a lawyer. They ended up setting out to the island, settled with pistols. Rankin ended up emerging the victor. Both men survived, though. But it's how things went in those days. But for the most part, when it wasn't folks shooting it out on the island, it was a place of tranquility and also a place of industry. We've got a painting right here by Robert Hopkin. It's called Comment ça va? So French for how you doing, essentially right there. In the foreground, we've got a farmer in a canoe flagging down a passing sailing ship here to sell some fresh produce right there. In the background, we've got Belle Isle, and you might notice this kind of reddish smudge on the tip of the island right there. It's actually some buildings. There's actually a tavern on the eastern tip of the island at this time. And that was, like as I mentioned earlier, this was a place to take livestock to graze, and there was also some other things going on there as well. It was home to 3 different fisheries for one. Fish would be caught and stored in pens on the island until it was time for them to be shipped out. In the winter, workers would harvest blocks of ice from the water and keep them there. And it was also home to a logging operation. So it was really kind of a place of almost heavy industry. And it almost got even heavier. We've got right here a plan from 1874. And around this time, the first attempt at building a railroad tunnel under the Detroit River started. Roughly kind of across from downtown, roughly where the current automotive tunnel is. If you look really close at the map here, though, you can see it says abandoned tunnel. They ran into some difficulty with that. I think there was a collapse. And instead of digging one long tunnel underneath, a wide part of the river, they said, well, how about we just build a narrower tunnel under the far side of Belle Isle and have bridges, these are railroad bridges, leading from the American side onto the island. So the island itself would kind of become a bit of a switching yard. They wanted to make some other concessions instead of just totally kind of turning this into a grimy train yard. There would still be a beach, it's completely surrounded by water, so they could probably find a spot to do that there. But they also had plans to put an asylum and a quarantine hospital on the island as well. So not quite the getaway that we think of these days. Luckily for us, though, the City Beautiful movement was gaining steam in this period. And its aim was to kind of set off the ills of the Industrial Revolution and growing cities with parks and beautiful architecture in those cities. And Detroit was one of the places where this really took hold. And they set up a city organization called the Parks and Boulevards Commission to pursue this. Appropriately for their name, one of their first efforts was Grand Boulevard, which in kind of modern parlance was envisioned as sort of a green strip encircling the outskirts of the city. Grand Boulevard was, as far as the city was stretched at that point. They also started looking at plans to develop some parks along the city's riverfront. But we had really gone whole hog with building up the riverfront with industry from very early on. So we couldn't follow suit of a lot of other cities that have kind of nice riverfronts. It was really only until they started chipping away at it with things like the Civic Center Park, which turned into Hart Plaza, and then the Shane Park, and now we have our modern Riverwalk. But they had been talking about this idea of doing a bridge-to-bridge park for decades and decades before we eventually almost have one now. So without that avenue for the Parks and Boulevards Commission to pursue, they started looking at Belle Isle. And this was kind of controversial. There's a bit of pushback. Some folks thought that, first of all, Belle Isle was too far out of town. Like I said, Grand Boulevard was the extent of Detroit at that point. And of course, the Belle Isle Bridge is right on Grand Boulevard now. And secondly, there was no bridge back then. If you wanted to get to the island, you had to have your own boat or pay to take a ferry across. And on top of even just getting there, the streetcars only ran to about Mount Elliott at this point in time. So you'd have to take potentially 3 modes of transportation to get to the island. So folks were kind of worried. They thought this was just going to become a getaway for rich folks. But the aim of the City Beautiful movement was really to kind of create something that, the rich and the workers could enjoy and benefit from alike. And in order to pursue this, the Parks and Boulevards Commission talked to somebody who is kind of one of the big names in the City Beautiful movement, Frederick Law Olmsted. And we have a quote from him here, kind of to the effect of addressing some of those concerns that folks had about kind of the aims for Belle Isle here. So we want a ground in which people may easily go after their day's work is done, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, and feeling nothing of the bustle and jar of the streets. And that's Frederick Law Olmsted right there. Might know him best as the guy who designed New York Central Park. He also worked on the World's Fair and things like that. Parks across the country, really. So his philosophy was very in tune with the City Beautiful movement and was had to do with, again, creating sort of a natural getaway in the city. It wasn't this kind of like carefully curated nature. He wanted it to not feel like a beautiful garden. He wanted it to feel like you were in the woods, but kind of the most perfect version of the woods. So in his proposal, he talked about how, don't put flower beds in. We just have, natural growing flowers and plants and things like that. He also said, specifically, to avoid things like dance houses, racetracks, museums, collections of zoology, and horticulture, which is Belle Isle in a nutshell these days. So, sorry, Mr. Olmsted. Something went astray, obviously, from Olmsted's plan. So how did things deviate so much? Well, it began pretty early on. So let's look right here. This is a map, a survey map of Belle Isle from 1882, and this was actually published in Boston, where Olmsted was from. So much of his, and this is Belle Isle before any of the park efforts came to it. So this is, it's not a blank slate, but as far as Olmsted's concerned, this is what he's kind of coming at here. So you see there is a dock here. There's some trails and things like that. So not completely wild, but he'd kind of, rein that in and make it even more wild in kind of a beautiful way. And this was, like I said, more or less the only way he knew the island. He actually only visited Detroit and Belle Isle once during this whole endeavor, and it wasn't a great time for him. He showed up kind of late. He had the boats weren't running anymore. He had to pay somebody to paddle himself over there. Kind of looked around, and that kind of set the tone for a lot of things, I think. So he did come up with a plan, though. He has paid a good amount, but he ended up kind of walking away from the whole project, saying, Detroit evinced a more hesitating and distrustful disposition towards the park undertaking than any other city he had worked with. And he went on to work on the World's Fair, had a better time with that. But as I said, he did deliver a plan. And here it is. This is a map of Olmsted's plan from around 1885. And you can see, it is pretty. All these trees are not in, nice rows or anything like that. But there are some big features. First of all, the one that really screams is the parade ground right there. And that is roughly where the athletic field is today. So that seems like, yeah, that carried over. Secondly, we've got this big avenue down the center here, right? One might call it a central avenue, which Belle Isle has Central Avenue, pretty much in that same spot. There's this loop here. So there's a couple things that look like the Belle Isle we know today. And it's really kind of the park skeleton that Olmsted provided. One of the big features that he did kind of go all out on, kind of contrary to what you'd think his philosophy was, is this right here. In this chart, it just kind of looks like a weird sort of blocky thing. But his concept was that the western tip of the island would have this big kind of colonnaded entryway that you'd arrive at in the ferry, and then you'd pass through that almost, it'd be the gates to the park. And then beyond that would be kind of, you'd be taking in nature. That didn't come to pass either. So we're going to zoom in a little bit. And it was $7,000 he was paid to come up with this. And we got a better view right here of kind of that loop area. There's some canals and things here, but they're not as kind of broad or, we don't have the lakes and all that like the version we know now. But we're going to jump ahead here to see an early map of this area as it actually was developed here. So you can see, Central Avenue right there, even got that loop canal there. It's not quite as, it's actually a little bit more natural than Olmsted's was, which, would kind of parallel Central Avenue there. But we've also got what the casino, the boathouse, the bathhouse, the boat club, so things kind of popping up here. This is about 1885 here. And let's take a closer look here. Central Avenue, right? But what's this right here? We've got a fancy flower bed right in the foreground. One of those things Olmsted specifically said not to have there. But look at all the people out enjoying it. Seems like it's a hit. The Western Loop Canal came in 1883. The parade ground became the athletic field. Walking paths were replaced by driving lanes. Natural planting was replaced by extensive flower beds. And the lagoons and the canals were dug, and we'll talk a bit about that soon enough. So we got another early postcard here showing the boat livery. Olmsted did suggest a boathouse in his plan. Here's the one that was actually built. And you'll notice, if you think back to that very first postcard we saw, they were in those fancy canoes. We've got just plain old rowboats right here. One of the, that's kind of one of the differences if you're trying to date an early image of Belle Isle, is they had the rowboats and then those got replaced with the canoes here. So very early image there. Here we've got a great shot overlooking both the first Belle Isle Bridge, which is this kind of truss affair right there. We also have the old ferry dock right there. And you can see the kind of, whoever colorized this didn't have much interest in whatever was going on in Windsor there. So it looks like it's just a big field. The ferry dock, like I said, was one of those rare bits where the actual realized version was a lot more restrained than Olmsted's concept. The bridge right here is, as I said, the first Belle Isle Bridge. And what happened with this one was it had a wooden deck on it, and in about, I think it was 1913, they were retarring the surface of the deck because apparently it had become a little bumpy and uneven. But because of those bumps, the cart that they had with the hot coals in it that was keeping the tar malleable hit a bump, and some of the coals fell out and burned down the whole bridge. So that was replaced with a temporary bridge, and then the Belle Isle Bridge that we know today came in the 1920s, which always threw me because does anybody know the name of the Belle Isle Bridge? The MacArthur Bridge, right? So I always assumed, oh, that must have been built after the war because why else would it be named the MacArthur Bridge? But it's just they renamed it after the war. It was just the Belle Isle Bridge officially before that. So very good. So one of the other early attractions on the island was the skating pavilion, which isn't too far from the Flynn Pavilion that's still there. But you can see this one, a much larger affair right here, and you even had this balcony up top where bands could perform and entertain everybody that's skating down below there. You can see a whole lot of people, so I hope that ice is pretty thick. Here we've got a view of the first of the Belle Isle casinos. And mind you, this is casino in that it's an old-fashioned word for a gathering place, it's not a gambling institution. This particular one was kind of just in line with the bridge there, which seems appropriate. This was, actually when they built this, it had a really short shelf life. The casino we know today came in just I think less than 2 decades after. There was actually a talk about moving this one onto the mainland rather than just getting rid of it. Didn't happen, but I think a lot of structures kind of built right around this time because building standards and things like electricity and telephone lines and all that were coming into play. I think a lot of buildings just kind of had shorter careers than stuff that was built a little bit earlier or a little bit later. Notice that with a lot of stuff downtown as well. Here we've got a view of the bathing beach here, along with the pier there. And everybody lined up there. Kind of a fun scene there, and more about the bathhouse later on. We've got a view right here, a much later view. This is a photo from the 1970s of what they call the 1890s pavilion right now. This is still there. It's currently, I think, wrapped up in Tyvek. I think they're doing another round of renovations on it, which makes me feel kind of wild because the first time, when I first started working for the Detroit Historical Society, I remember they came to us to ask about repainting it, and they were trying to see if we had any color photos that showed it kind of as it was originally painted so they could match that, which 1890s, we don't have those, but I thought it was still kind of cool that they were, cared enough to try and make it look exactly like it did way back when. So it's kind of going through its second round of renovation since then. So right here we've got the Detroit Boat Club, one of their buildings. I believe this is the 4th Detroit Boat Club. They went through a whole series of buildings. Started out on the mainland and moved here. One of them actually burned down too, until they finally opted for the concrete one that still stands here. Speaking of stuff burning there, you can see a view of the bridge. The Detroit Yacht Club here took over a building that was used by the Michigan Yacht Club. They again went through a whole series of buildings, moved from the mainland. This one right here that we see right here is roughly where the beach and the swimming pool are today. The current Detroit Yacht Club, which is on its kind of own island off of Belle Isle, came in later, and we'll talk about that process in a little bit as well. Belle Isle was also home to the second zoo in Detroit, which was, again, one of those things Olmsted specifically said don't build. And the first zoo in Detroit was appropriately enough where they would go on to keep the lions and the tigers over at Michigan and Trumbull. And of course, this is the seed that grows into the fairy tale themed zoo and then the safari themed zoo, and that's the one that's currently closed down on the island right now. Fingers crossed they do something with eventually. So two of the kind of mysterious buildings on the island, a lot of people see and don't quite know the story behind, are these ones right here. The first one here is the dairy barn. And the concept was that, if the city was running this as a park, they might as well kind of harken back to the old days and still raise some cattle on the island for dairy purposes, sell those. It's still there. I think it's just used for storage right now. I always assumed it was part of the zoo gatehouse because it kind of seems seamless with that architecturally wise. And I think one of the reasons why it looks so modern is because, even though it's obviously an old architectural style, is because it's been the subject of a lot of really great renovations over the years. I think the Women's City Club did a great job on it in the 70s or 80s. And I think there was some work on it going on much more recently as well. The other one right here is kind of tucked away. It's still there if you know where to look. It's behind the, if you're kind of going behind the aquarium, there's those greenhouses on the opposite side of the road from that. This is tucked away behind those. And this is Insalrua, or the White House. And this was the residence of the Campo family when they lived on the island. It was one of the perks of being the head of the commissioner of the park, that you'd get to live there as well. And we'll get to that idea and maybe who that kid out front is in just a little bit as well. So had we stuck with Olmsted's plan, we wouldn't have had so many great examples of architecture by important Detroit architects on the island. Of course, the biggest name in Detroit architecture is probably Albert Kahn, and we've got some great examples by him. The Ann Scripps Whitcomb Conservatory, the aquarium, the lighthouse there. The Livingston Lighthouse is a big Art Deco affair. It's easy to miss kind of the part of year where there's leaves on the trees, but if you're driving around the island in the fall or the winter, you're sure to catch it over on the eastern tip. It's a bit of a hike to check out, and it's fenced off. You can't get right up to it or get inside, but it's really cool to see. Only all marble lighthouse in the country. And it's also not pictured here, but Kahn also designed the Reverend Samuel Smith Memorial Flagpole, which is the big flagpole that's over at the athletic fields there. So kind of interesting when when I think Kahn, the first thing that always comes to mind is the Fort Rouge complex. So it's neat to see him doing many different styles here. And of course, right now, a lot of people are probably aware that the conservatory is going to be closed for about another year or so because they're actually doing some heavy-duty renovations on the dome. It's actually the second round that they've done that. They closed it down, I think, in the 50s to replace the original dome, which was lumber-based, with steel, and now they're replacing that once again. So it's closed down for, I didn't get to go that last weekend. I wanted to check it out, but I'm excited to see what they do with it. And if you go over there now, it's all kind of wrapped up there. Van Leeuwen and Schilling were behind the present casino, which was built in 1908. Again, I said, that old casino had a very short shelf life there. And one of them was also affiliated with the Parks and Boulevards Commission, so I always kind of wonder how that contract got doled out there. George Mason designed the Detroit Yacht Club, and he's also the guy behind the Masonic Temple. So two very, very extravagant buildings. If you ever get an excuse to check out the Yacht Club, take it. Alpheus Chitterdam gave us the Detroit Boat Club. And William Knapp did the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, which, I'm of course near and dear to my heart. I thought it was kind of a weird looking building. Looks a little bit like a 1950s middle school. No slights to 1950s middle schools. He's also designed the Detroit Historical Museum, as well as bits of City Airport, which is a really great Art Deco design to that. And then the Players Club and the Scarab Club as well, which are, really extravagant in their own way. So again, he's like one of those guys that has a lot of range. So, and don't judge him too much about his kind of weird blue box here. So, one of the things I mentioned we'd get to is who built the lagoons. Well, the snide answer is these guys right here. Obviously, they're digging it. This was the era of Pingree's potato patches. This was a rough time. A lot of folks were looking for work. So there's a lot of laborers that were kind of available to help do the dirty work of beautifying the island and giving us those canals that folks would soon enough paddle around and splash around in. But the vision for the lagoons and the canals started with a guy by the name of Michael J.D. And he was a Detroit news editor. And his idea was that, sure, it's great to paddle around the Detroit River around the island, but you're going to be battling the current, you're going to be out there with shipping traffic. What if there was a way to paddle around the interior of the island? That'd be a lot more kind of soothing, a lot more relaxed. So in order to kind of enact this vision, he enlisted a guy by the name of William Ferguson, who had worked kind of as a horticulturalist, but also had some experience with landscaping. And he was appointed superintendent of the island. And I have a quote here that talks about how much influence that William Ferguson kind of exercised in this role. When Mr. Ferguson was appointed superintendent of Belle Isle Park in 1887, he prepared the present comprehensive plan meaning not the Olmsted one. He turned mosquito breeding grounds into pretty lakes, ran fine drives through what had been wilderness, established flower beds, changing the plants with the seasons. In short, he changed Belle Isle from a wilderness to a place of blossoming beauty. And he did all this, and all this was done so quietly and unostentatiously that many of Belle Isle's thousands of visitors did not know him by sight. But now, thanks to this crude drawing that looks kind of like a police composite, you kind of know him by sight there.
He looks like a criminal.
He does, yeah, looks very suspicious there. As far as Olmsted would say, he might as well be, because all those things that he did were contrary to Olmsted's vision for the park. But it's as I said earlier, Olmsted provided the skeleton for the park, and Ferguson came along and turned it into the park that we more or less know today. Of course, there was a lot of evolution that happened between now and then, which we'll talk about in just a second. So I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits of being superintendent of the park was you got to live in the old Campo house. So maybe this kid, proudly standing outside of the White House right here, is William Ferguson's son, George. George wrote a great memoir about growing up on the island, which he later donated a copy of to the Historical Society. And he writes about all the things you'd kind of assume would be in any old Detroit memoir from that era. So he talks about going to Hudson's when it was in the old Opera House and things like that. But then he has all these super unique experiences that only somebody that grew up on Belle Isle would have. So he talks about having like a sailing boat that he'd go out on. He'd have to paddle to the mainland to go to school and all that. He had a horse that he'd ride around on. There's a quote from it: "During the summer months, my life was almost a continual round of pleasure. I had a good rowboat and a sailboat and a horse to drive." He also talks about trying to impress some girls with his sailing prowess on the Detroit River, but ending up capsizing and getting dunked in the river there. And that's all at this point, George wasn't, of course, the only person in the river. Really bad transition here, but Detroit was really booming at this time period, and there was a ton of traffic on the Detroit River and the Great Lakes more broadly as well. The Detroit River was one of the busiest waterways in the world. In fact, in 1907, the Detroit River carried more tonnage of cargo than the ports of London and New York saw combined. Not that it was coming here, just that it was passing through and going all around the Great Lakes. So again, with all this kind of commerce happening all around us, Detroit was really starting to boom in size. And a growing city means new buildings are getting built. And new buildings getting built means foundations are getting dug out. And foundations getting dug out means there's a whole lot of extra dirt hanging around. So what happens with that? Well, at this point in time, a guy by the name of Colonel Edward G. Heckel had become the commissioner of Parks and Boulevards. And it was under him that Belle Isle got expanded. So we've got a chart of Belle Isle from about 1900 here, and it's not quite the island we know today, right? It's kind of stumpy on this side, doesn't quite jut out there. Detroit Yacht Club's here and not there. So we're gonna move to a much later map here from about 1940 and keep an eye on kind of the outline of the island as we go here. So here we have a map from 1948, and you can see the island's literally transformed here with that fill that built up certain areas there. Another great thing, can't hammer on this enough, by 1948, there's a list of 100 attractions on the island. So 100 things Olmsted probably would have hated, but of course some of our favorite things are in place by this point. One of the things that grew out of this, especially down here, is the Scott Fountain area. You can see we now have that kind of sharp point down at the bottom there with the reflecting pool and the fountain as part of that. Scott Fountain's a fun story. James Scott was a very rich but very hated Detroiter. He kind of inherited his money. He was known for kind of gambling and being kind of an unpleasant guy. And there's even a story that was circulating that might not be true, but the very fact that there was a story going around about this guy kind of gives you an idea of how people thought of him, even if the details aren't quite right. But the story goes that he really didn't like kids, and his mansion, which is over on Peterborough, was adjacent to a lot where kids would play, and he built a big wall on his property to kind of blot out the sun over where the kids were playing. So kind of a Monty Burns plot there, right? So a little bit larger in life perhaps, but again, the fact that this stuff was kind of circulating, not a popular guy. A surprising thing he did though is when he passed away, he willed his money to the city. He was a rich guy, so it was a lot of money, but he did this with the stipulation that it be used to build a monument to him, which of course nobody is really jumping on doing. So the Common Council, as they called the city council in those days, took the money and invested it. So it started out as a big pot of money, became an even bigger pot of money, and eventually they hatched a plan to build the Scott Fountain, which is, a giant complex. And it includes a larger than life-size statue of James Scott, but it's really kind of lost in the landscape with, the fancy fountain and everything else going on there. Kind of appropriately enough, whenever I go to the Scott Fountain these days, there's always kids climbing on the statue, so it seems kind of appropriate. And that's not even to get into the pigeons. So we got a view here of Belle Isle in 1950. And this, I think we actually narrowed it down. This is like January, February, and March of 1950 because of kind of first of all, the season, but also the combination of things that are there. So very kind of narrow detective work about how to date an undated photo going on here. So there's a couple cool things to notice here. First of all, this right here, there's a boat kind of beached on its own little island right there. That's a JT Wing. And the JT Wing was brought in to house the Maritime Museum of the Great Lakes. The JT Wing had kind of its own wild career. It was originally built in the Caribbean. It came to the Great Lakes. It was the last commercial sailing ship on the Great Lakes. It was a Sea Scout training ship. It sunk twice, once accidentally, the second time intentionally. So it kind of went through all these different careers over its life before becoming a museum. So it was brought up on land, and they had exhibits on that. The thing is, if you have a boat that was used to being in the water and was very in the water for a time being, bring it out of the water, it starts to rot. So it started to rot. The inspectors took a look at it and said, you know, we can't do this, we got to get rid of it. So it had one last job, which was a firefighter training scenario. So they actually fired at it with tracer rounds from a Tommy gun to light it, and then they put it out. So kind of probably going overboard in lighting it there. I think somebody just wanted to show off, but that's how they got rid of it. And after it was burned, that's where they built the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. So that was after an interim of it being in the exhibits being in the basement of the Historical Museum. And the Dawson opened in 1960. We also have the Nancy Brown Peace Carol in here. It was built to celebrate a beloved but very kind of private Detroit News advice columnist by the name of Nancy Brown, and she'd hold annual prayer breakfasts and things on the island. So she's kind of like the anti-James Scott. She was very beloved, and people took up a collection and kind of built this thing in her name. It still tolls, or chimes. It's not hand rung, it's all automated, but it's kind of one of those things on the rare occasion where it's not going or anything, you kind of realize right away, oh, something's off on Belle Isle today. So this, Belle Isle looked almost as we know it today, but it still had to kind of morph and mutate, and there was a lot of kind of false starts and kind of other potential paths that the island could have taken. This is a redevelopment plan from around 1972 for the island. And this one would have done a couple kind of pretty radical things. There's some kind of, the basics are still here. The real basics are still here. We've got Central Avenue. The Olmsted's old parade field is still the athletic field right there. But look, they've got some facilities next to the athletic field. There's a whole kind of like theater and more of a cultural activity center built up to accompany the conservatory and the Dawson and all that. There's a public marina, which we've never had on the island, and that's in the spot where the beach is today, and then the beach is moved over to the Canadian side there. So, of course this was not to happen, but folks kept coming up with ideas. This right here is a redevelopment plan from around 2000. And kind of zoomed out here, it looks busy, but we'll see in a minute kind of how radical it is. This was actually the plan that the city of Detroit was under right up until when the state took over. The only real developments that came from this plan, though, are the fishing piers around the island that popped up around, I think, 2000, 2001. But it was supposed to go a whole lot further than that. We've got a view here showing, again, kind of the conservatory and the Carolyn area right here. There's a gatehouse built. They would have brought us a tall ship. I don't know where they'd get that, but I won't argue if they bring us a tall ship. So again, and more kind of structures and stuff out here. Again, pretty radical, but was not to happen. When the city was really in its hour of need, somebody came in with this plan in 2012 to buy up the island, turn it into like a hotel development here. I think the concept was even to go far enough to that this would make it, since it's on international border, make it a independent country or something like that. I'm no engineer, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But I do know that the water level is only about a foot or two beneath the ground on Belle Isle. So I don't quite know how you build giant buildings like that. But
I'm glad that didn't happen. That was so ugly.
Right? Yeah. Imagine that. That would be like right on the periphery of any view of the riverfront right there. So obviously it didn't happen, but it's not the first kind of radical skyline altering plan that folks had for Belle Isle. This is one of my favorite things to find in the collection. This is a postcard of something that wasn't built published as though it was. And we actually have a lot of these in the collection. And this particular one, this is for Detroit's bicentennial in 1901. They wanted to build this giant column on the island that would have towered over. It'd be like having our own Statue of Liberty here, just in the river here. And they kind of bring back that Olmsted idea of having, the tip of the island set up like this, gateway with this, kind of like classical column set up there, mirroring the giant column. I said that this didn't get built, which isn't entirely accurate, because this actually did get built. Does anybody recognize it? That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it ended up in Put in Bay as the Perry's Victory Monument. So much like Toledo, it's another thing that should have been in Michigan, even though it didn't end up that way. So into the 20th century, Belle Isle saw its share of turmoil. During World War II, the military used the island to practice amphibious assault drills. We got a view right here, kind of almost like shades of Omaha Beach, but with the Belle Isle Bridge in the background there. During the war was probably perhaps the most notorious incident to happen on Belle Isle. In 1943, the weather was hot. Detroit's population was rapidly outgrowing the availability of housing, with all the folks coming in to work wartime jobs. And folks did what they always did on hot summer days. They went out to Belle Isle. It was very common for people to sleep on Belle Isle, before air conditioning was, as prevalent as it eventually became. The tensions of the time weren't as escapable as the heat was, though. And in 1943, the Detroit race riot broke out, and it began on the island. Rumors spread that, depending on who you asked, an African-American woman was tossed off the bridge by a white mob, or vice versa. Neither actually happened, but that didn't stop kind of the rumor from moving and violence spreading along with it. So, and it spread from the bridge to the mainland. We've got a view right here of a mob ripping a guy off a streetcar. The violence spread up into the Black Bottom neighborhood that was adjacent to, not too far from Jefferson. It's a really ugly situation here. As a response, the Detroit Police Department began riot training on the island, and we've got a view of a phalanx of cops on the island in 43 here. Now, moving a bit further ahead to 1967, but probably not where you think I'm going just yet, was the riot that year that no one remembers, or as they say, if you do, you weren't really there. That summer, WABX held one of their love-ins on the island. The bands played it, like the MC5 and SRC were there. And almost kind of shades of Altamont, there was run-ins between kind of the hippie contingent and the biker contingent. The police shut down the bridge so people couldn't get off. So it kind of kettled the fighting, made it a bit worse. But that was really just the run-in for kind of the more serious incident that happened that year, which was, the 1967 riot or rebellion or uprising or whatever you want to call it, which plug if you haven't been to the 1967's Perspectives exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum. It's an award-winning exhibit that kind of looks at all the ways people have contextualized and experienced the events of that summer. And it's all based on oral histories and interviews. Really fantastic exhibit that was originally just going to be something that was going to be up for a year or two, but has been such a huge deal, we're kind of keeping it up. So if you haven't gone yet, there's still time. But Belle Isle's role in the unrest that year had to do with people were getting rounded up in record numbers, and there were running out of places to house people. So people were getting stored on buses, in garages. This was another hot summer, the long hot summer, as they called it. So one of the more humane outlets that they were jailing people was the Belle Isle Boathouse, which had shower facilities and stuff like that. And we actually have a film in our collection of people getting marched off a bus, getting tossed a towel, and past like armed guards and going into the old boathouse, which was, or not boathouse, the bathhouse, which had fallen out of use at that point. Not too long after the incidents that summer, the bathhouse was demolished. I think it was already, because it was already fallen out of use and was considered kind of beyond repair, but I got to imagine that the, kind of the new memories about it contributed to that as well. But by and large, though, the good days outnumbered the bad on Belle Isle. And this is one of the things I promised earlier. This is a view, if those women in that first slide look behind themselves there, this is the bridge with the band shell on top that they'd be looking at if they turned around. And you can see everybody kind of paddling along, listening to the music right there. So to end things on a high note, or a 40-foot high note, in fact, I've got to say some words about the giant slide, or should I say giant slides. You might remember last summer, this big hit on the internet, videos of some rough rides on the giant slide there. I did a bunch of research, actually got interviewed for NPR about it. So yes, there were actually two giant slides. The one that's the most recent one is a newer one. It's been there for a little bit. It's not new, but it isn't the original slide. And the original giant slide, the big yellow one here, was opened on July 4th, which Belle Isle's name, the naming of Belle Isle's birthday there, July 4th, 1968. And that was actually supposed to be the first step of a larger $400,000 project to build a private amusement park on Belle Isle, which was going to be called Funland. Originally, that all got okayed. It was on the up and up. They built the slide, but pretty much as soon as they finished the slide, there's a big construction workers strike in Michigan. So further progress on the park was totally stalled. And around that time that happened, kind of word got out about the full plans for Funland, and they began to see a lot of resistance. Folks were, on one front, were kind of opposed to the idea of taking public land and turning it into a private paid park. People were upset about, this was 1968. People were very kind of cognizant of what had gone down the previous summer, and they're concerned about kind of creating, area of the island for haves and the area for have-nots. You have your dinky swing set over here, and you have your roller coaster over here. Some people are just kind of practically upset about, like, where's everybody going to park? So a lot of letters flooded into newspapers, to the city council, and they ended up kind of rescinding the contract to build Funland. The company that was originally building it got to run the slide, but they were, the city council was kind of in charge of how much they'd charge for a ride, which they kept down for a good long time. I think it was originally supposed to be 15 cents, and it very slowly rose to about 75 over the next couple decades. By 2004, that original 1968 slide had seen a lot of riders, and a lot of riders going down a whole lot of times. I know I'm responsible for a good bit of wear on that thing. So they opted to replace it with a newer slide. It took about a year to do. I think it was just kind of packed up on site for a good couple months. I remember driving by it. But the one that's been there has been there since about 2005. And this is a steeper slide than the original. So I think that's one reason for the faster rides there. I don't know what changed between 2005 and last year, if it's just cameras in the right space, or if it's some that has to do with surface wear or what, but you guys saw the videos. So with that, any questions or anything?
The Native Americans, of course, had lived there first, but what country claimed Belle Isle in the beginning?
So it was the
Like who was the first settlers?
it would have been when the British purchased it. So that would have been kind of that first area. And there was British settlers that lived on the island beyond just the McCombs. There was like a army officer that had a house on the island. So that too.
I'm surprised that we hear about Olmsted, but we don't hear about, was it Ferguson?
Yeah, exactly. It's
I hear about Olmsted all the
all the time. I think it's one of those things where, we want to. Olmsted's got the name value. You mentioned him. You're instantly affiliated with New York and Central Park,
You think
so
that's why?
you get kind of some of that cachet. And he was part of the picture, but it was kind of just the bones of the plan. So I think that's why he's kind of steals the glory there. So, but absolutely, yeah, that was when our previous curator, I think, did a interview about that way back when. There's a bit of a pushback about kind of the Olmsted loyalists didn't want to see him kind of moved out of the limelight there. Any other questions? All right. Oh,
It's enjoyable. I
Oh.
don't have any questions. I learned a lot listening to you.
Yes.
oh, well, thank you. Thanks for coming in.
I have too learned a lot.
But just one thing, thinking about it.
Yeah.
Where the fish are, the aquarium.
Yes.
Now, was that built by Kahn?
Yeah, that was designed by Albert Kahn as well. It's actually conjoined with the conservatory. They walled it off. If you think about, I don't know how well you know the conservatory, but there's the room where they have the kind of annual displays going, like where the poinsettias are around the holidays and all that. There's that kind of rock wall back there, and that was originally an entrance to the conservatory that they walled off. And I think I don't know if it's still in the cards, but I had heard one of the plans for the renovations were to open that up again. I don't quite know how that works with kind of the needs for plants versus the needs for an aquarium and the climate and all that, but I know that was something they were talking about a little bit. So.
I think it's a beautiful place, the aquarium.
Absolutely, yeah. There's
All the green tile and that.
Right.
It's like you're underwater.
Absolutely. It was patterned after I just saw a really great lecture about kind of the genesis of the aquarium and some of the other institutions that inspired it. But yeah, there's a couple other kind of ones around the world that he was kind of looking at and bringing the best parts of together here. So.
Is an aquarium fully operational today?
From what I understand, yes, it was a bit of a walk. It should have touched on this, but as you might remember, the aquarium closed down in the 2000s, and prior to that, it was the longest continuously operating, or the oldest operating aquarium in North America. Which, when you stop continuously operating, you kind of lose that crown. So you don't have that anymore. But they did come back. It was a bit of a slow start. I remember going there one of the first weekends it had reopened, and they were kind of doing their best. I mean, they brought it back, so I'm not criticizing, but they were using like the aquariums, the tanks that they couldn't fill with actual fish. They had like artwork and stuff in those. But last time I was in there, I think it's totally occupied again. The new contingent of fish, I think they really kind of lean in towards the Great Lakes fish and things like that, but they still have some of the favorites in there, so like the electric eels and all that, which of course would do the show and like the bulb during feeding time and all that are there again. So.
There's so many statues on that island, and when you're driving,
Yes.
you can't really
Yeah.
see what it is. Is there a brochure or something that explains who and what
That's a
those statues are?
I don't know about a freebie one. We have a nice brochure that explains all the outdoor stuff at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, but more broadly, when you have like the what is it, Brigadier General, blanking on his name. We were just talking about him the other day at work too. I should remember this. And then like the Dante statue and all that, and the Newsboy Fountain and all that. There is a book that's been updated a couple times called Art in Detroit Public Places. I think it's published by Wayne State Press. It's a pretty thick book, but it's a nice kind of size, nice format one. So it's something you could stick in your glove box. But they break down all the art on Belle Isle and all the public art around Detroit. Really fantastic book. There's an older edition of it that was available on Google Books for free. I don't know if it's still there because that stuff kind of comes and goes. But Art in Detroit Public Places is the name of it. Highly recommended. It's something I use all the time. And there's been a couple of different editions, so you might even find an older one at at a used bookstore or something like that, and the stuff doesn't change that much, so probably going to be just as good as a brand new copy.
Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for coming. This was fantastic. I've only done a couple of these in the last couple months. It always seems like we slow down during the winter, but this was I feel like I had my spiel together this time. So I'm glad this was the one time they were filming me. So thank you.
Very informative.
Thank you for watching our presentation. In order to discover upcoming events at the library, please visit our website, westlandlibrary.org, and click on our events calendar for a full list of everything that we have. You can also visit our Facebook page at Westland Library for daily updates. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you soon.